Hey everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. Today's tutorial is about the camera, and I want to talk a bit about how I approach the camera's setting with the focal length, the aperture, the composition, and so on. So let's just dive straight in. So the case that I have taken today is a product shot. So I made this shot here, just a simple setup with a lamp, let's talk about how the camera affects how we view the product itself. So if I go into the camera settings and into our camera, let me just take this one up. You can see the first options that we have up here is the lens option here. And what this determines is things such as the focal length and also the perspective type. So right now it is set to perspective, and that's kind of like a neutral, normal way of seeing what the camera sees. We can also use like this orthographic view here, and it will be much more, if I just dial this one in, it will be more sort of like graphic and more, it's not that realistic, but it can be used in, more like graphic design stuff. I have seen it be used quite a lot, but I want to stay with like the realistic results, and especially for these types of shots, I think the perspective type works well. But you can experiment with it yourself. Sometimes the orthographic view can be quite nice as well. But the important thing here under our lens is the focal length settings. So I have set the focal length to 200 millimeter, and the reason for that is that it's quite a nice focal length when doing product shots. And I come from like a photography background, and I normally tend to use a higher valued focal length when doing product shots. And the reason for that is that, first of all, when the focal length is this high, it does not distort the image. And we'll show you just in a bit how the focal length can affect the distortion of the image. But this high focal length sort of compresses the scene together, so we can, we have this scene here, but because of the way that lenses work and focal length work, we have sort of like a more compressed view of our scene here. So we can fit even more of our scene into the frame and not, lose any details and things from the scene. Like a typical focal length in photography is the like nifty 50, it's called, is the just the standard 50 millimeter lens. And this is something that, can be used for every case, you might have. As you can see here, compared to the 200 millimeter lens, it's kind of a bit more distorted. It's not that it seems, unrealistic or weird or anything like that, but you can kind of tell that there's something off compared to the other image that we had. We see more of this area here, the plane where the lamp is on, where we saw it more, we saw less of it on the 200 millimeter lens. If I just go back to the 200 millimeter lens, you can see if I just go back to the same kind of position, you can see we don't have that much space here compared to the 50 millimeter lens. But you can of course go with the 50 millimeter lens, and this will also be a good focal length if that's the look you're going for. I actually quite like this, and because of the roundness of this lamp, this product in particular could work well with different kind of focal lengths. You know, a good portrait lens would be like, for example, a 85 millimeter. That's typically something that would work well for like a portrait of a human. So, it can also be used for products like this one here, where you want to have sort of like a middle ground between like the the lower 50 millimeter lens and something higher past 100 millimeter. Past 100 millimeter, I don't think you will see that big of a difference, like on if you just keep it simple. Of course there is a difference between a 100 millimeter and a 500 millimeter lens. The compression that you get in the image is much higher. You can compress a lot more things into the same frame with a 500 millimeter lens compared to a 100 millimeter lens. And you can also sort of like look these things up yourself. If you, for example, write on Google like difference between a 100 millimeter lens and a 500 millimeter lens, you will see sort of like images that compare those. But for like just like product photography, go with a higher value. I would suggest, just so you don't distort the product, and you make the product the important part of the image. You could also go with a more stylized look. So for example, you could choose like a 24 millimeter lens, and this would of course distort the image even more, as you can see here. And it looks quite weird. You could also go, just to emphasize it even more, go down to like a 16 millimeter lens, and now you can see the ground here being really distorted. And one of the things that's happening right now is that you can see these balls, balloons, whatever it is, it's kind of also being distorted. So this is not round anymore. It's more like more flat, so to speak. So you could of course use a low focal length such as the 16 millimeter, but it would drastically change the image that you are working on. I have another camera set up here, and you can see how this is now a more of a top view, and it's set to 200 millimeter. So now we don't have any distortion, and it's quite nice placed within our frame here. But let's say I choose like a 16 millimeter lens, and let me just zoom into our product again. You would see how it's being almost sort of like really distorted. And there's a lot of film directors that likes these more like fishbowl kind of views. Would be something like in a movie when you see people being like high on drugs, for example. You would typically use like a sort of like a lower focal length that would really distort the image, making the everything seems out of proportions. So if you want to like give this weird feel to your images, you could do that. Also here, this is much larger than this part down here, so we really have a focus here, and you don't really have an idea of like exactly how the product looks in like reality. And that's why I typically don't suggest using really low focal lengths on product shots if you're not sure what you're doing, and if you are not doing it for like an aesthetic sort of purpose. So because a lot of the focal lengths is just set automatically within 3D, like as a standard, maybe a 35 or 50 or something, you would have to learn what these things over here does, and what the different kind of focal lengths does. So I hope that I've just now briefly just summed up that what my approach is when doing especially product photography is normally going with a higher focal length above 85, even normally around 100, 200 stuff, and never using like the 35 or 20, 24, 16 millimeter lens. Only if I want that stylized look that you can see over here now. Let me just go back to this one here and change this one back to 200, just so we sort of as you can see, it's way more realistic and more it's just it seems more right in sort of a weird way. But yeah, so yeah, that's the focal length, and it's set to millimeter, and that's how it also is in the real world. But let's just go further on with like the settings and how we look at things. The camera, the sensor size is set to auto, and it says to 36 millimeter, and that's totally fine. I think it works sort of like a full frame camera. And yeah, and the viewport display here, I normally under the composition guide put these thirds on, and what you can see here is that they sort of give us these lines here, and it just helps me line up the different part of the image to these lines here. If you look up the golden triangle and stuff like that in photography, you can see that people often place things here in these kind of intersections here, these four intersections, and also have kind of a bit of breathing room here from the top of the product up to the top here. It's always important to keep a breathing room in your images, and keep consistent with like the composition. Everything should be in line, and both sides should have the same weight. So what I did here, for example, just to give you an example, is that I filled the scene with these balls here, and I made this huge ball over here. And now you might think, okay, I should also make a huge ball over here, but this is where our light comes in, so I didn't want to affect that. And it didn't seem right only putting this one here. So instead of having one big, I actually put two balls over here. So I thought that would kind of like balance out the image. So you should remember to balance each side of your image, and where you place the hero. You could have placed the hero up here, but then you should have something down here, for example, to kind of balance these parts here. And the this composition guide with the rule of thirds here can help you. It's called the rule of thirds. It can help you line up and get a good composition in your image. So, but I won't be talking much about that here. That's quite a huge topic. Under the Octane camera settings here, I'm using Octane, by the way, but you can see it's the same in cycles and whatever, so whatever render you use. Down here, and what I like about Octane is that they give you kind of a lot of options. You don't really need these options, but it's because they want to show how the real world settings are. So for example, you have something called f-stop and depth of field and aperture, and basically aperture and f-stop is the same. The aperture is illustrating like the size of the kind of hole that lets in light in your camera, and it's measured in f-stops. So f-stops is kind of like the measurement sort of tool for the aperture. So that's why they have included it here in Octane. I think it's because Octane, is this real renderer that tries to imitate like the real life settings. So it's not checked on by default, and you also have like the autofocus set on. But what I typically do is that I will use the f-stop because that's what I'm used to within like a camera. I think this one was set to like 0.89 or something like that. But I will actually check off this box and says, and what's this, the result? It's 2.8. And I will check on the use f-stop, and I will disable autofocus. And I don't like autofocus because I want to have control over where the focus is on my image. So I've just placed an empty right here because I want the product to be in total focus, and I just picked this part up here. I think that will be the sharpest point of my image. So I set the depth of field setting here. I set that to this empty here. And if I just scroll in here, just so we can take a look at it, you can see it's actually kind of blurred out. And that's because we have quite a low f-stop. And the reason why I use f-stop is because these settings here is more what I'm used to in like a camera, where it's also set in f-stop. So normally I'll just see if I have like an image of it here. Yeah, I took the screenshot here. You can see here how the f-stops for like, this is typically what you will see in like real world camera settings. You have aperture f-stops going as low as f1.2. That's actual lenses that can go this low with the f-stop. And the lower the number is here, the more light it will let in reality. That's not the case with CG because we have like an infinite amount of options and we don't really need the real life calculations because we can do whatever we want. But if you are to look at the real life settings, there is a few lenses that can go down to f1.2, and there is and normally f16, f22 or something like that is normally the highest of f-stops. So this is where they will sort of this is where there will be no light. As you can see here in the illustrating, the hole is really small compared to over here, but you shouldn't think about that in CG. What you should think about is that the f-stop, the lower it is, the and I mean lower in like 1.2 being the lowest, is where you will also have the most like bokeh, the most depth of field in real life. So if you want those really nice portrait shots of a person, you would typically go with like one of these lower values here because you want sort of like the background out of focus. And as you can see here, we have a 2.0 f-stop set, and because we're using a really high millimeter lens, that will also affect these settings here. So if we want more of the image to be in focus, we will need to set it much higher because we also have a much higher focal length. And yeah, I know that's very, very technical and also took a while for me to completely understand how it worked in real life. But what you should just understand is that we can use a higher value. So let's say the lowest one would be like a 1.2, and you can see this is really out of focus now. And I hope it goes through on the stream here. And it wouldn't be this out of focus like in real life because, yeah, I don't know. It's just how the camera works here in CG. But we can go way higher and set it, for example, to 16. And now you can see we actually have the entire product in focus. And we can go even higher if we want. And that's what I mean with like, CG. We could go to 100. And it's not even like a thing in real life, but we can do it. And this way, everything would be in total focus now, for example. From the balls here to the to the plane, to everything is completely in focus now. But I would just to imitate how it would be in real life, we want to have some sort of like a little bit of depth of field. I think normally for like a product shots, we want the product to be in focus, so we don't really care too much about depth of field in product shots. But to imitate like real life, I think we should go with a lower one. So maybe 5.6 here. You can see we sort of have like the edges of the lamp out of focus, but we still have this area in focus here. We could also go with like another typical focal length, like a 7.2. It might not be that noticeable, but it will add to the realism of your scene here. So let's just keep it at the 7.2 f-stop, and we use an f-stop, and we have ticked off the autofocus, and we're focusing on our empty here. And I think that's actually everything now. Oh yeah, under the Octane camera imager, just remember that when you have enabled this one, the vignette is already set to 0.3, because in every lens there will be some sort of like vignette in real life, but you can turn this one off and you don't have any sort of like vignetting. I also sometimes just set it to 1.5 just to give it just a bit of crunch on the edges here. And I'm using the ACES tone mapping, just override with that and set the response type to linear off. And no upsampling, no denoising right now. And yeah, I think that's all. And then yeah, the that's basically all for the camera settings, and then there's all these other settings here. But yeah, I hope you just learned something about the camera within CG and how it works, especially with like Blender and Octane, and how like you can use it on these sort of like product shots here. So yeah, see you for the next one. Bye.